Hello, my name is Jim Toot, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Central Virginia Community College. In this video, we'll discuss foreign and national security policies, Part 2, Influence from Congress and Outside Government. The constitutional division of power between the President and Congress is an invitation to struggle over the privilege of directing U.S. foreign policy. This struggle is most likely to take place when different political parties control the presidency and Congress, when powerful members of Congress disagree with the administration's policy, and when these policies are controversial or unpopular. The president's ability on occasion to make decisions and take action quickly gives him more power over foreign policy than Congress, which takes more time. Nonetheless, Congress can be influential by asserting its amending, oversight, and budgetary powers. By attaching amendments to pieces of legislation, Congress has directed foreign aid funding to specific countries for purposes such as aid for Israel, buying products made in America, and prohibiting money from being spent on family planning programs. But amendments are normally limited to relatively minor policies. Congress can also exercise influence through oversight of the executive branch's implementation of foreign or military policy. During the Vietnam War, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Senator William J. Fulbright, held hearings critical of the administration's conduct of the war. During the George W. Bush administration, committees in the House and Senate held hearings on the abusive treatment of prisoners by U.S. soldiers at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq and what higher-ups in the command knew about them. But hearings usually take place after policies have been implemented or too late to change them significantly. Congress can also influence foreign policy through its budgetary powers. It can reduce or even refuse to fund programs. But congressional budgetary powers are blunt and not fine-tuned to the particulars of a policy. Cutting off funding is particularly difficult when it makes members vulnerable to accusations, especially in campaign advertisements directed against them by their opponent, of failing to fund the troops, as happened during the Iraq War. Budgetary controls also do little to offset the president's authority to commit the United States on a course of action by announcing such policy decisions as a war on terrorism. The struggle between Congress and the president to control American foreign policy and military policy can also take place over three constitutional powers that the president and Congress share: appointments, treaties, and war. Appointments. The president appoints, but the Senate has the constitutional authority to approve appointments of ambassadors and those charged with running government departments that conduct foreign policy, such as the Departments of State and Defense. This gives the Senate a voice in how these organizations are run. The Senate does readily and routinely confirm most appointees, but this is often because the president, anticipating objections, usually makes unobjectionable appointments. Treaties. The Constitution states that it is the president who, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, negotiates treaties. The approval of 2/3 of the senators voting is required. The Senate does not always consent. The Republican-controlled Senate, for example, rejected the Treaty of Versailles negotiated by Democratic President Woodrow Wilson following the end of World War I. This treaty created the League of Nations, the forerunner to the United Nations, but with the treaty's rejection, the United States did not join. Today's presidents routinely include key members of the Senate on negotiating teams as a means of obtaining advice before and easing consent after a treaty is signed. The Senate's power of advice and consent is somewhat negated by the president's increased reliance on executive agreements over treaties as a means of entering into agreements with other states. Unlike treaties, executive agreements do not require the consent of the Senate before becoming law. Presidents are free to enter into them at their own discretion and to end them when they see fit. Congress has tried to curb this power, but with little effect. In the 1970s, it passed the Case-Zablocki Act that required presidents to inform Congress of any and all executive agreements they enter into. War powers. The Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war and to raise and maintain armed forces. But when does a state of war come into existence? The United States has sent troops into battle over 125 times in its history, yet Congress has declared war only 5 times: in the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican War, World War I, and World War II. No direct declaration of war preceded the entry of American forces into the Korean War. President Harry Truman all but ignored Congress, basing his use of force on a UN Security Council resolution. an argument that would be used again later in the Persian Gulf War and the Iraq War. Vietnam, too, was fought without a declaration of war. When the legality of this war was challenged, defenders pointed to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, in which Congress authorized the president to take whatever steps he felt necessary to protect and defend American forces in South Vietnam. The war's defenders also pointed to congressional votes authorizing funds for fighting the war. The argument was that if Congress did not support the war at all, all it had to do was stop the authorization of funding to fight it. The congressional presidential struggle over war-making powers came to a head during the Vietnam era and led to Congress passing the War Powers Resolution over President Richard Nixon's veto. This resolution effectively allows the president 90 days to wage war without congressional approval. No president has recognized the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution, though none has openly challenged it either. Influence can be exerted on foreign and national security policy by think tanks, interest groups, and the public through opinion polls and elections. Think tanks are private research organizations that seek to influence public policy. They have been referred to as idea brokers because they help define the issues on the policy agenda and options for addressing them. Foreign policy is an area in which think tanks have become especially active for several reasons. First, it has become much more complex. No longer restricted to national security, foreign policy encompasses trade, finance, human rights, the environmental and cultural issues. Second, the information abilities of the government have been overwhelmed by this expanded foreign policy agenda. Long-range planning and strategic speculation are now commonly produced by think tanks, as is current information on breaking issues. Third, think tanks provide multiple and competing policy recommendations backed up with supporting information. A wide variety of groups try to influence U.S. foreign policy. There are economic groups such as the Chamber of Commerce and the American Farm Bureau Federation. There are ethnic groups representing Arab, Greek, Turkish, Chinese, Cuban, and Eastern European Americans. Ideological and public interest groups seek to influence U.S. foreign policies in such areas as human rights, Amnesty International, and the environment, the Sierra Club. Interest groups often conflict on an issue. In the debate over creating free trade areas, such as the North America Free Trade Agreement, business groups were pitted against labor and environmental groups. In other cases, one interest group seems to dominate the policy area. This has long been the case with the Arab-Israeli conflicts, where the Jewish American groups, notably the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, have been particularly influential. Americans have limited attention and low levels of knowledge about the details of foreign affairs. Nonetheless, they have views about foreign policies. These are influenced by the opinions of the trusted elites as communicated, not always accurately, by the media. One question that has received considerable attention is the American public's opinion about the use of military force. The conventional wisdom after Vietnam was that America would not support military action if it resulted in significant casualties to U.S. troops. This was called the Vietnam Syndrome. As a result, any military involvement in the future would have to be short and involve overwhelming application of force. People are most supportive of the use of military force when they believe it is to protect the United States against attack. Nonetheless, protracted conflicts lower presidential popularity. Witness Korea and President Truman, Vietnam and President Johnson, and Iraq and President George W. Bush. In summary, Congress is involved in foreign and military policies through its amending, oversight, and budgetary powers, and through the constitutional powers related to appointments, treaties, and war it shares with the president. While Congress has sometimes worked to limit the president's autonomy in foreign policy, the use of executive orders and the ability to enter military engagements without formal declarations of war have ensured the president's continued primacy in international affairs. Forces that sometimes influence foreign and military policy from outside the government are think tanks, interest groups, and public opinion.